All right. So we're all really gathered here today for the Global Day of Action for Climate Justice. So what does climate justice mean? Climate justice is really all about fairness and equity in this fight for climate change. So I'm going to specifically be talking about how climate change and animal agriculture actually affects indigenous peoples, people of color, and various other communities. And so I'm going to be specifically speaking about how the meat industry actually thrives on environmental racism. So on this Global Day of Action for Climate Justice, let's recognize that climate justice is food justice and racial justice. It must all work together. The meat industry thrives on environmental racism. Environmental racism is the term used to describe the disproportionate impact of pollution and other environmental hazards on people of color. In order to transform our food system for the animals, the planet, and people, we must acknowledge that the meat industry has a long history of racial discrimination. It's often the communities of color that have the least access to healthy, nutritious food and have to feel the most negative impacts of factory farming and climate change. If you haven't lived near a factory farm or processing plant, it's hard to imagine the horrors inflicted on the surrounding communities. But the fact is that Black, Latin, and Indigenous Americans and people of color in Canada, including immigrant communities and Indigenous peoples, are disproportionately threatened by animal agriculture. North Carolina is one of the clearest examples of this. In 2016, the Environmental Working Group released a collection of maps and data revealing that the environmental costs of North Carolina's 6,500 factory farms disproportionately affects vulnerable communities. In North Carolina, the world's largest pig farms showed a linear relationship between where communities of color were located and the location of the pig farms. Neighbors residing close to these factories and the lagoons where the manure of the pigs was disposed of reported that they cannot open the windows to their house. They cannot participate in outdoor activities or even sit on their porch without enduring the horrendous stench from the waste particles being sprayed in the air. I want you just to imagine that. How would it feel to be sitting outside your house and all you can smell is the smell of death, the smell of pig manure, and all your neighbors, they've contracted asthma, they've contracted all these diseases. Simply why? Because we are supporting industrial pig farming. Inhaling the animal waste has serious health effects on the people living nearby. The waste contains ammonia and other harmful chemicals, which can lead to serious health issues when breathed in. Water pollution is another major factor for those living in agricultural areas, where the residents rely on the groundwater from the community wells that are often contaminated with pesticides, animal waste, and fertilizer byproducts. It's not uncommon for nitrates, a chemical found in the manure and the fertilizer, to actually pass through the soil and contaminate the water. So far, we've talked about the way animal farming perpetuates environmental racism, but now let's talk about the climate justice perspective on how the impacts of climate change caused by the animal agriculture industry actually affect people of color as well. So the devastating effects of climate change, of which factory farming is a major contributing factor, often impact lower income communities, communities of color, and other vulnerable populations that simply don't have the means to relocate, rebuild, or otherwise manage climate change impacts. It's often the people who've done the least to actually contribute to climate change that are feeling the greatest effects. For example, in Africa, the entire continent of Africa only contributes 3% to global emissions. However, they are facing droughts, they are facing shortages of water, they're facing shortages of food. And it's just so sad when we as rich countries are actually perpetuating these impacts, right? And these individuals that haven't done much to contribute at all are actually feeling these effects. But it's really not just in Africa. In Canada at home, wildfires have actually been all over, right? We all remember last summer we had wildfires from BC all the way to Ontario. However, these actually disproportionately threaten a variety of Indigenous communities. A lot of Indigenous communities, they have a deeper connection with the forests, and they live in harmony with nature, and they also live in these reserves where a lot of wildfires are close to. So 32% of First Nations population in Canada actually resides in areas where wildfires take place, compared to only 17% of non-Indigenous Canadians. And First Nations reserves actually were 1/3 of all the evacuations that happened for the fires. So we've seen that the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities doesn't also just end with Canada. In Brazil, which is the home of many Indigenous peoples, are destroyed by deforestation, as deforestation threatens the Amazon. Now, 91% of deforestation in the Amazon is due to clear cutting and logging to make room for cattle ranching, guys. And that is truly, truly horrible. So the true cost of beef is the cost of the homes, the ancestral lands, and the livelihoods of Indigenous communities in the Amazon. As tree after tree falls to the forest floor and the rich biodiversity of the Amazon disappears. The true cost of pork is the cost of intergenerational trauma and disease in poor African American communities in the US, living close to factory farm pigs. And here at home in Canada, the true cost of all beef, pork, and chicken are the continuous wildfires that will burn our sacred forests every summer as climate change ravages our nature. The true cost of industrial animal agriculture is environmental racism and climate change. There will be no climate justice without addressing animal agriculture. Climate justice starts with our daily choices. It's amazing that something as simple as the food that we use for nutrition and for sustenance has the potential to change this entire narrative. By eating whole plant foods, fruits and vegetables for the bulk of your diet, you are not only making an incredible impact for your health, but the health of communities around the world damaged by animal agriculture. By eating delicious vegan substitutes for your favorite meals, of which there are now thousands, you are saving yourself from another summer of wildfires and doing your part to ensure that they don't happen in another Indigenous community. By drinking delicious coconut or oat milk, you are not only having a tiny environmental footprint compared to the animal milks in terms of emissions, but you're also contributing to a thriving and healthy Amazon rainforest and the sacred lands of its many Indigenous tribes. Ladies and gentlemen, it is almost magical what we can do simply by changing how we eat. Let's end climate injustice together. Won't you join me and the millions of other passionate environmentalists around the world by choosing a plant-based diet? Thank you.